So far, we have seen that objects marked as navigation static will be baked into a NavMesh. They will therefore automatically be avoided by NavMesh agents. But what if we had a dynamic object, an object that couldn't be baked into the NavMesh, either because it moves around or because we're procedurally generating our level and we have no idea where it's going to be when the game actually starts up? For these items, we need to set them up as NavMesh obstacles. A NavMesh obstacle is effectively just something that gets in the way. Now you might be wondering why NavMesh obstacles are even required. Here we have this arena surrounding our sheep, and we have this little wooden train in the way. This wooden train has a collider on it. So you might think that, okay, this sheep is going to hit this train and it's going to stop. But if we run this, we're going to see that that's not quite what happens. In fact, the sheep goes completely through the train. The reason is that the sheep does not have a rigid body, and it may or may not even have a collider. This wooden train does have a collider, but again, doesn't have a rigid body, so no physical collision is being detected by the physics engine. The result is that this sheep can walk directly through the train. Since our sheep isn't being driven by physics, it's being driven by this navigation agent or NavMesh agent, we need to add a component to the train that's going to turn it into this obstacle, into this thing that's going to get in the way. To do that, I'm going to go to Add Component, Navigation, NavMesh Obstacle. Now there's a couple different ways to use this NavMesh obstacle, but let's look at the properties first. First off, we can choose the shape of this obstacle. Our choices are either a box or a capsule. Since the point of the navigation system, our pathfinding system, is to be as efficient as possible, we don't really do very complex shapes. We can also choose the size and the centering of this NavMesh obstacle. We have this fourth property called Carve, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But before doing anything else, I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and we're going to see that by virtue of simply adding a NavMesh obstacle to this train, the sheep obeys. As we can see, the sheep is looking around and it can't figure out how to get out. Since this is a dynamic object though, I can move it and we'll see that the sheep will realize that the train is gone and then continue on its path. If I take a look at the NavMesh, I'll see that the train doesn't affect the NavMesh in any way, even if I were to now rebake it. This is great for things like doors that are dynamic, that don't ever need to be static, and will constantly be opening or closing. Again, the NavMesh agent uses obstacle avoidance to realize this dynamic obstacle is there, and it waits for it to be gone to continue on its path. If we want a more efficient solution, however, such as maybe an obstacle that's going to be placed but then rarely ever moved, we can make a change to our NavMesh obstacle component to make that happen. Going back to the inspector, if I look at the NavMesh obstacle component and I check this box Carve, what I'm effectively doing is I'm telling this NavMesh obstacle to carve itself into our NavMesh at runtime. A few new properties appear, such as Move Threshold, which is how far this obstacle has to move before it gets recarved into the NavMesh, Time to Stationary, which is how long does the object have to sit still before it carves itself into the NavMesh, and Carve Only Stationary, which basically says, hey, only carve into the NavMesh when it's standing still. Unchecking that would make it more accurate, but also much less efficient. So I've used the term carve a few times now, but we don't really know what that means. Now that I've checked that carve checkbox, I'm going to go back to navigation. And what I'm going to see is that the NavMesh has actually been modified by this NavMesh obstacle. As a matter of fact, if I were to move this NavMesh obstacle, I would see that the NavMesh changes with it without any need to rebake. That is because this object is a dynamic object and is thus not baked into the NavMesh, however it is carving its presence out of the NavMesh in real time. Using the carve feature on a NavMesh obstacle component is great for situations where you have geometry that you need to move maybe one time and then never move again. Those types of objects are often seen in games that have procedurally or randomly generated levels. Games like this have geometry that will be placed in random locations or various locations every time you play. We don't know where they'll be until runtime, and so we can't set them as static. This NavMesh obstacle provides an adequate compromise between the two methods of doing this.